Good morning and welcome to the 11th meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Could I first of all please remind everyone, if they've not already done so, to switch off any mobile phones, tablets, Blackberries, etc. The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. The second item of business today is to take evidence on the UK economic and fiscal outlook. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting Robert-Chote, Chairman of the Office for Budget Responsibility. Welcome, Robert. And I'd like to invite you to give a short opening statement to the committee.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me back. Perhaps I should just start by saying a little bit about the economic and fiscal forecasts that we published at the time of the UK budget and how those have changed since the previous forecast that we published at the end of last year. If you start on the real economy, the outlook is slightly weaker than we'd anticipated then. The growth rate in the economy in 2012 was somewhat higher than we'd anticipated in December, but the economy seemed to have slightly less momentum coming into the final quarter of the year. Partly that was because of disruption to production in the North Sea, so there was a hit to GDP from that area specifically, but more generally with things like weaker than expected average earnings growth, continued deterioration in export performance. Our sense was that there would be slightly less momentum coming into 2013 than that we previously anticipated. As a consequence, we've revised down slightly our growth forecasts for 2013 and for 2014. I wouldn't overstate the scale of that. If you look at the combination of the fact that activity in 2012 was higher than we'd anticipated and the fact that we've cut the growth forecast from 1.2 to 1.6 for 2013, it means that we anticipate that the economy this year will be about 3 1,000ths smaller than we anticipated back in December. So I wouldn't overstate the scale of that, even though the change in the proportionate change in the percentage change is obviously looks relatively large. In terms of the forward outlook, as I say, a little bit weaker performance for 2013 and 2014, relatively widely spread across the components of GDP. So, for example, expecting a weaker contribution from consumer spending, partly because average earnings are weaker, which would mean less money in people's pockets. The outlook for inflation in the near term slightly higher, so that money stretching less far in terms of what people can buy with it. As I said, we've had a weak export performance, and if you were to go back over the whole of 2012 and say what is the single factor which most obviously explains why activity has come in weaker than we were anticipating, say, a year ago, it would be this deterioration in export performance. Some of that is relatively obviously explicable from conditions in the Eurozone and in other UK export markets, but there does seem to be an additional unexplained element to the deterioration in export performance, which we and other forecasters will be keeping obviously a close eye on. One slight warning here in terms of the data is that we thought we were in a similar position a couple of years ago when it looked as though export performance was weak relative to what you would have expected given how far the pound had fallen against other currencies. The Office for National Statistics then revised the number and found some additional exports down the back of the sofa, and part of that mystery disappeared. So there's always the possibility that we will find history rewritten to get rid of some of that mystery, but for the time being, export performance does look relatively weak compared to expectations. On business investment, we've revised down the growth rate there slightly. That's partly reflecting the fact that the level back in 2012 has been revised higher, so if you're starting from a higher base, you would expect less growth going forward to get you to what looks like a relatively plausible medium-term position. So if you go look over the full 5-year horizon of our forecast, at the end of it, real GDP is 0.6% lower than we would have anticipated back in December. So again, 6 1,000ths smaller in 5 years' time than we anticipated in the previous forecast. So that gives you some sense of the scale of the change, not enormous. In terms of forecasting the outlook for the public finances, Ironically, although public attention understandably focuses very much on what we say about real growth in the economy, it's actually the growth in the cash size of the economy that matters much more for the state of the public finances, because if you're taxing incomes and spending as a proportion of incomes and spending, it's as a proportion of that cash amount rather than what the statisticians happen to say is real growth relative to whole economy inflation. And there we've also revised down our view of whole economy inflation over the longer term. That's partly because of the fact that the inflation in the government sector has turned out to be different from what we've expected. We've had a continued puzzle whereby more of the deterioration, as cash spending plans have been cut, more of it is showing up in inflation rather than in the what the statisticians judge to be the contribution of the government's consumption of goods and services to real output. Anyway, so that means that at the end of the forecast, nominal GDP, cash GDP, is about 2.5% lower in 2017 than we anticipated at the end of the last year. And it's that's the key driver of what's happening on the fiscal side. If cash spending, cash incomes are lower by that amount at the end of that period, then you would expect cash receipts to be lower equivalently. So we've revised up our estimates of borrowing in cash terms over the 5-year period, and that's primarily because of a weaker outlook for cash spending means fewer cash receipts coming in and correspondingly higher cash borrowing. If you look at the public finances in terms of shares of GDP, the picture looks more like a spending problem rather than a receipts problem, because the average tax rate, the receipts as a share of GDP, doesn't change very much. Receipts are lower, GDP is lower, the share is not very much changed. But if you're setting a lot of your spending plans in cash terms, welfare payments linked to consumer price inflation, and you then lower GDP, cash GDP, then those spending items look larger relative to GDP. So a weaker outlook for government finances over the 5-year period. Our view being that the government is still on course to hit its fiscal mandate, which is borrowing no more than it needs to invest, adjusting for any remaining spare capacity in the economy at the end of that 5-year horizon. But we continue to take the view that they're more likely than not to miss their supplementary target of having public sector net debt falling as a share of GDP in 2015-16, and that's by a slightly larger margin than we anticipated back in December, which largely reflects the fact that you've got more borrowing going on in the intervening years. So that's the picture in terms of the fiscal implications and the fiscal rules. In terms of the specific Scottish tax forecast for which we're responsible, basically most of the change between the last forecast and this one is reflecting the changes in the UK-wide expected receipts, of which we assume a particular proportion for Scotland, rather than taking a very different view about what that proportion is. So on the income tax side, looking forward, you have a weaker growth in average earnings, in particular reflecting the continued disappointing weak growth in productivity. That has an impact on future expected income tax receipts for the UK and through the Kalman wedge as well. Also, in terms of the starting point for income tax receipts is somewhat weaker. If you look at the numbers that have come in early this year, PAYE receipts, particularly actually outside the financial sector rather than being the usual financial sector story, have been weaker than expected. That's in line with the relative weakness of average earnings. On the self-assessment side, self-employment, the number of people self-employed has been rising quite rapidly, but it looks as though fewer of those people than we expected are earning enough to be paying income tax. So the average effective tax rate on self-employment income is lower than we anticipated then. On SDLT, a weaker outlook for housing transactions and prices has a modest effect there, but I would have said it's the income tax picture which is the clearest feed through to the devolved receipt streams. And as I say, I think that's primarily a story on the UK numbers rather than a particular asymmetric UK and Scotland effect. So perhaps if I leave it there, and happy to expand on any of that.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that interesting introduction. Now, we've got up to 2 hours for this session, so I don't intend to be a situation where I ask a battery of questions and then colleagues do likewise. What I want to do, I'll probably ask 3 or 4 questions to start off with and then allow colleagues to come in, and they can come in again and again as they see fit, so we have a much more wide-ranging discussion. Which I think would benefit the full committee. So I want to start off just by talking about the Scottish rate of income tax, because we had a pre-briefing from Professor David Bell, our budget advisor, before this, and this is obviously a key issue for the committee and indeed the Scottish Parliament. And you mentioned in your introduction where some of your predictions were 3,000ths or 6,000ths out. However, in terms of the OBR's prediction of the Scottish rate of income tax, there is, I'm quite astonished at the huge changes that have actually been just over the last year. For example, between March 2012 and March 2013, it was, first of all, March, the adjustment had to be increased in December by around 3%, and then from December to March it was reduced by 3.5%. For the year 2011-12. For 2013-14, there's a 7% reduction from your predictions in March last year to March this year. But if we actually look at 2016-17 forecasts, you're predicting 13% less income tax than you did a year ago for Scotland. And clearly there's alarm bells ringing in terms of the wide variance in these forecasts over such a short period of time. So I'm just wondering if you can explain those fairly significant changes.
Sure. I think with these numbers, indeed this is true for most receipts flows, you have a combination of new information in terms of the recent data that's been coming in, plus whatever judgments you make about how things are going to evolve further out. So in terms of the changes in the data that we've received recently, you get some of the most important information on income tax in the early months of the year, partly because that's when self-assessment receipts are coming in. So, as I say, those receipts, non-self-assessment PAY receipts have come in relatively weak compared to our expectations, and some of that mechanically knocks through to the future years of the forecast, because you're then applying growth rates to what you think you've had in the previous year. And so there, I think the unexpected weakness of PAYE is consistent with the fact that you've had average earnings growth more weaker than we had anticipated. That's been a story for quite some time. It seems partly linked to the fact that the productivity puzzle, the fact that productivity growth has continued to be relatively weak. People appear to be pricing themselves into jobs. One of the reasons why you have this puzzling, relatively impressive performance of employment relative to what's going on in terms of the output of the economy. So I think if you're looking at the PAYE element, that's probably where the explanation lies. On self-assessment, the people are filling in tax returns, and there's a lag then in the information that you get with that, because people are paying that money in with a lag. As I said, the puzzle, I think, particularly on this occasion, has been with self-employment. Self-employment has risen significantly, but the tax receipts that you would get from self-employment people have not risen as much as we would have anticipated had we known with confidence that increase in numbers. And that suggests to us that the increase in self-employment, more of it is coming in the form of jobs for people who are, on relatively low incomes and therefore are paying a low average tax rate, which pulls down the average tax rate for self-employment income as a whole. And so you have that being the primary story on the self-assessment side, weak average earnings across the economy, weaker than expected average earnings across the economy on the PAYE side. At the moment, all of this story of what's going on in outturn data is complicated at the top end of the income distribution by the changes of the income tax, the announced changes in the higher rate of income tax, 50% then to 45p. One of the difficulties that is created in terms of working out what the underlying strength of income tax through this is that in both cases, the previous government with the 50p rate and the current government with the 45p rate have announced those changes in advance. So it's created an opportunity for people to shift income from future years into earlier years, or from earlier years in future years, to take advantage of the fact that those rates are changing. And so if you've got that money, as it were, sloshing about, in the case of the 45p rate, there's now a desire to push back some income. So we're talking here less about individuals who are on regular salaried income, who don't have the flexibility to do that, but more company directors, for example, who have a choice of when to pay themselves more clearly. In the case of the 50p rate, there was a temptation to pull a lot of money forward, and the estimate suggested maybe about £16 billion was pulled forward. And then with the 45p rate, you have it pushed back. So there is more uncertainty than there would usually be about how you interpret current outturns in income tax receipts, and there will continue to be for a time, because you can't obviously predict with confidence how much people are going to be willing and able simply to move income from one year to another before you get back to a steady state. In terms of the outlook going forward, i.e. the growth rates that you apply to incomes heading from and to income tax receipts from where you're starting, I think the major factor here is that we're assuming weaker nominal earnings growth, i.e. weaker cash growth in earnings. And that's basically a reflection of the fact that we have once again had a surprise that productivity growth has been weaker than anticipated. More people being employed, but less, but no more corresponding output being created at the same time. The assumption that there's probably a relationship between improvements in productivity and the willingness of employers to increase cash earnings, the fact that you've had more gloomy news on that has led us to assume that there will be weaker growth in that going forward. And the further you go forward, obviously that accumulates, and therefore the level difference between the two increases. So, it's I would say under these circumstances, unfortunately for anybody trying to plan these sorts of things, volatility and changes in forecasts are not particularly surprising, even though we would wish it to be otherwise. And obviously, once we get out of the intertemporal adjustments to the 45p and 50p rate, things will be a little bit clearer. In terms of the Scottish impact as well, another uncertainty looking further forward is obviously what is the Scottish share. Now here, as you know, at the moment we're basing estimates on the Survey of Personal Incomes, which is basically a sample of tax returns across the UK, which you can identify the Scottish share. That will become better, and hopefully the forecast therefore less volatile and less erratic when you get to the point at which HMRC is flagging particular taxpayers as Scottish taxpayers or not on the basis of the definition that they're using. My understanding is that it's unlikely that that flagging is going to be done much in advance of the point at which the devolution of the flow goes. So I don't think we're going to be in the position that ideally we would be, where that flagging had been set up and we had some chances to look at a series of annual forecasts on the basis of that flagging. I think we're probably going to be relying on the SPI, and then the flagging will be done shortly before the new the devolution of that flow comes in. So there will be an additional uncertainty, but hopefully longer term greater stability thereafter.
Okay, in December 2015 will be the latest date at which, under the Act, the Scottish Government will have to set an income tax for April 2016 onwards. I mean, what impact do you think it will have, having to set it as early as December 2015 or earlier?
In terms of the difficulties it would create for forecasting, I think crucially it depends on how different the rate would be from 10%. I mean, clearly, if it's 10%, there's all the uncertainties about what the outlook for income tax receipts would be anyway. If it's significantly different from 10%, you then have the additional issue about trying to judge how people's behaviour is going to respond to that differential. And basically, the larger the differential is, higher or lower, the greater the uncertainty, I suspect, in terms of trying to judge how people are going to respond to that.
In terms of your forecasting, though, on this, how much do you take into account things like relative immigration to Scotland as opposed to the rest of the UK, and looking at the comparability in income tax receipts You know, because we're only talking about a certain element within within taxation.
Yeah.
So are you looking specifically at those points?
Not specifically in the sense that what we were struck by when we embarked on the process, which we were discussing with the Scottish Government when we went along, of setting up the methodology in the first place, we were struck by quite how stable the Scottish share had been of the UK share as a whole. So given that and the variations in those things in the past, it didn't seem as though we were going to be able to learn much that we could be confident about in terms of micromanaging from that relatively broad stability. As you can see in the forecast, the share settles down at a lower percentage in the future than it has been the 3.1x that it has been fairly stable at going back over the past. That's a reflection of policy changes, not of a response to those sorts of non-policy influences on the share. Essentially speaking, you've had policy measures that are increasing the tax burden on the relatively well-off in income tax and the personal allowance benefiting people at the bottom, and because of the relative income distributions between the UK and Scotland, that suggests a lower steady-state Scottish share looking forward than we've had on average in the period prior to the changes. So you have that effect as well. I think, as I say, once we get to a position once we or Revenue Scotland are in a position where you have this flagging that will allow you to not to rely on samples with all the variation and measurement error that is implied in that, and much more on a sort of clear administrative link to who are particular Scottish taxpayers, it may be easier to look at those sorts of effects than it is at this dividing the cake approach that we're using by necessity at the moment.
We're just going to ask you a couple more questions and I'll let colleagues in. One is regarding the reduction of the block grant associated with the devolution of SDLT and LFT. I'm just wondering if, whether you think the reduction should be fixed in nominal or real terms. Is that something the OBR's got a view on?
No, it's outside our remit to say what that process should be. Our job is simply to provide the forecasts. It's for the UK and the Scottish governments to decide what, if any, use they want to make of those in determining what the block grant reduction should be. I mean, my sense from having looked at the debate over it is, clearly you need a shared view of, what is a fair basis of doing this. Are you trying to have a block grant reduction that is particularly linked to what you would have expected the existing system of SDLT to raise in 2015-16, or are you wanting to take a sort of broader holistic view of, what is the flow of receipts that is being foregone and the flow of receipts that's being taken in replacement from 2015-16 onwards, and to sort of make a fairness comparison between the two of those, whether you want to be backward-looking or forward-looking as well. So, as I say, it's not for us to say what is the fair way to do it, and I'm not even clear that there's maybe I've just not read it or seen it anywhere, a shared view about what the actual, what the question is, to which the answer is the amount of money by which the block grant is going to be reduced, if you see what
Absolutely. I mean, it's unbelievably complicated. I think everyone around the table actually appreciates that, but is it your view that the Scottish budget would be enhanced or not if it was nominal or in real terms?
Well, if you think about about a one-off change, you would assume that the amount that the revenue stream you're foregoing is presumably going to fall as a share of GDP, given what's going to happen to public expenditure as a whole, and therefore the share of that would be allocated to Scotland, given the outlook for public expenditure overall. The receipts that you would be gaining, obviously we don't know yet what the rates and rules of the proposed new transactions tax are going to be, but presumably in common with the existing system of SDLT, it's going to be dependent on a combination of house prices and on transactions in the property market. Transactions are relatively weak by long-term standards at the moment, partly reflecting the difficulties in the credit conditions, etc. So you might expect that any transactions tax is likely to see a rising share of GDP if house prices roughly move in line with cash GDP as a whole, but you simultaneously have a rise in transactions back to something like a more normal level, although the open question, of course, is what is the eventual quote-unquote normal level to which we will be returning. So that's why I say if you're doing a very forward-looking approach, are you trying to weigh not just how much money comes in and goes out in that particular year, but what the likely trends of that are in the future, which is, I presume, why these will be such interesting negotiations when they take place.
Just to ask one final point here, the UK and Scottish governments have agreed to utilise the index deduction method known as the Holtham method. In fact, Professor Holtham will be at committee next week. For adjusting the block grant following the introduction of the Scottish rate of income tax. However, Professor Holtham has suggested this might not be in Scotland's interest if our own tax base grows more slowly than that of the UK. What's your own view on that?
I would defer to him on that. I haven't looked at it closely, but as I think the aim of the Holtham system is, as it were, to create an incentive to encourage the growth of the tax base relative to the UK as a whole. So it depends on if he's less confident that Scotland can get its tax base to grow more rapidly, then maybe that would be where his concern is coming from. Presumably there would be others who would say that the greater policy, flexibility and ability to design policies would hopefully make that the opposite likely to be the case. But it's not something we've taken a view of.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to open the discussion to colleagues, and the first person to ask a question will be Jamie, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thank you, Convener, and it's following on your line of question about the issues about the block grant adjustment in light of the devolution of certain taxes. And following on from that, I was wondering if Mr. Chote could tell us how the OBR is equipped, what its ability is to accurately forecast receipts from these taxes once they've evolved the land and buildings transaction tax, which is obviously the replacement of stamp duty, land tax and landfill tax.
Yes, well, the way that the process works at the moment in terms of producing the baseline forecasts for existing tax receipts at a UK-wide level is that we have discussions with HMRC on each of the tax bases in the run-up to each budget and autumn statement. So they will come to us with a paper setting out their view of what all the particular determinants of the tax receipt are. So in the case of SDLT, you're particularly interested in on the residential side on house prices and housing transactions. And so they, as it were, crunch the numbers in terms of us telling them what we think are reasonable assumptions to make about the changes in transactions, about the changes in house prices. They have information on the distribution of houses by different value and the likelihood of sales, etc., and then we come back with a number. Now, as I understand it, obviously in the new system, Revenue Scotland will basically be managing and administering the new system. You have, I think, the registers of separate registry data, which would be able to hopefully to do that. So what we will need to do is to talk to Revenue Scotland about setting up a similar sort of arrangement that we have with HMRC of working with them, because we will have to have our own forecast of what those things are going to produce. Whether the Scottish Government produces its own forecasts, whether you create a Scottish OBR, whether Revenue Scotland publish these things itself, I'm not sure. This may be decided and I'm just unaware of it, but obviously from our point of view we'll need to talk to them. But it's essentially, if they are managing the system, they have the data available to them, it will be for us to talk to them about what they think are reasonable assumptions to make for the determinants and about how they think the best way to model these things is, and for us to reach a view on whether that's something that we're happy with to use for our own purposes. Generally speaking, those conversations we've had with HMRC, with other government departments in the rarer cases where other taxes fall under their remit, that's worked very well and happily.
I mean, clearly you're saying you need to get the information from Revenue Scotland, registers of Scotland are involved as well, of course, and a Scottish Government, and I think you more or less hinted there, Revenue Scotland could essentially do this job of forecasting, so might that not make more sense for us in relation to these devolved taxes? Certainly for us as a committee, with the best will in the world to you, we're probably going to be able to speak to Revenue Scotland a bit more readily have them before this committee a bit more readily?
I'm not quite sure I see the distinction. I mean, we, for our own purposes, because we have to produce UK-wide forecasts, we're going to have our own estimate of these things, and we will want to talk to Revenue Scotland about those. In the UK context, the government used to publish its estimates of what all its taxes would raise, and it now doesn't. What I don't know is whether under the new system, the Scottish Government would be intending to publish its own estimates of what these things would raise. Would they leave it up to us to talk to Revenue Scotland and to use the numbers that we publish? Or would, as I said, I don't know whether there's any intention of having an independent scrutiny body to look at the forecasts and to be responsible for publishing them or overseeing them. There's a variety of ways in which that model could work. We're happy to, obviously, to talk to the Scottish Government and Revenue Scotland about how we can best do this as painlessly as possible for everybody concerned.
I want to turn to the issues around the oil and gas sector. I understand that Malcolm Webb from Oil and Gas UK wrote to you on the 13th of March setting out the level of investment over the last year and this coming year that their sector is making in the North Sea, and of course their expectations for the production rate. And understanding his letter to you, he said that the most recent forecast commentators are using as your autumn statement forecast, which is based broadly on last year's activity survey. This information is now over 12 months out of date. How do you respond to the industry view?
Well, when we do each forecast, we use the available data that we have at the time, which is basically, obviously, oil and gas, UK oil and gas produced data. DEC, Department for Energy and Climate Change, have twice annual surveys of producers and what they're producing, and then they will make their own forecasts on the basis of that. We have to look at the combination of information that's there and produce the numbers which we think are central. It has to be said that, I mean, if you think predicting economic growth is difficult. Predicting North Sea receipts on a year-to-year basis is extremely difficult, and they are highly volatile, and I would expect them to continue to be highly volatile. If you go back over the last few years, not unusual to see falls or increases of 40 or 70% from one year to the next. That reflects the complex combination of determinants of what the North Sea receipts are going to be. You have production of oil production, and gas production, prices for both. As those prices are typically set in dollars in world markets, you have the sterling dollar exchange rate. You then have expenditure, which the industry can set off against tax, and you have any changes in the tax system as well. So if you look at those sorts of factors, they're all moving around in different ways, which helps explain why you end up with a particularly volatile path. And certainly, the current estimate of what North Sea receipts came in at in 2012-13 is a good deal lower than we anticipated it would be back in the first forecast that we were producing back in 2010. So I think, if memory serves me right, about 6 billion rather than 10 billion, which goes to show how large the variations from year to year can be, and the forecast errors can be. And I'm afraid that has long been the case for North Sea receipts.
You make a great deal of the price volatility, but the industry are saying your figures are 12 months out of date, and in the same letter, Mr Webb set out that the industry had invested nearly £25 billion in infrastructure investment, capital investment in the North Sea over the last year and this coming year. I mean, presumably you expect they're investing that money. These are hard-headed businessmen. They're investing that money because they expect a return, don't they? So,
yes, which is the reason we're expecting production to flatten out, having fallen 13 years in a row.
So their view that your figures are 12 months out of date, is that correct or not?
Well, we take we do the forecast we do on the basis of all the information that's available to us at the time. As I say, I think DEC are producing their numbers with higher frequency than UK oil and gas. I think it would be fair to say if you look back at both of their production forecasts over the last few years, they've both tended to be over-optimistic relative to the outturns.
So let's look at the oil price then. You're forecasting that the price will drop from $112 a barrel in 12-13 to $93 a barrel in 17-18, but the OECD have suggested oil prices could exceed $150 a barrel by 2020. With all their expertise, could you say what your organisation's view is of the OECD forecast?
Well, I think if you look at a range of oil price forecasts over the next 5-year period, you'll see a very wide range, some going up, some coming down. What we've done as an assumption is basically to say we don't claim to be any experts on the oil market here, so we will take the prices implied by futures prices. So, for example, if you look at the IMF publication on the world economy, which came out yesterday, they have a chart showing the oil price futures, same basic pattern. Obviously, they did the forecast a little bit later, so it's a bit lower, showing Brent oil prices falling, but pointing out what a huge fan chart of uncertainty you would place around that. So there are some forecasts which are higher than ours over a 5-year horizon. There are some that are lower. I think if you look at the set of price forecasts that were compiled in the Scottish Government's Oil and Gas Bulletin and also the CPRR one, one of those had had some forecasts above ours, or above the futures price. The other one had it below it. So once again, I think it underlines how uncertain this is. The oil price is now, when we started, it's now down to 100 from 113 from where it was. But clearly, this is a very volatile market.
You're not experts in the area of oil and gas. Would you accept that Oil and Gas UK and the OECD probably are?
As will be all the other people who produce forecasts which go in the other direction. The futures market, as you say, people making hard-headed investments, maybe some people are making hard-headed judgments on what to buy and sell in the futures market. So it's not going to be a perfect answer, but for the time being, it seems to us to be a reasonable one to go with. We're certainly going to keep that under review. We want to look, for example, at how liquid the market is at different time horizons, but I think the idea that there's any you just have to look at the range of forecasts over that 5-year period, and you just have to accept that this is going to be a very uncertain profile of receipts for anybody to try to predict over that horizon.
Malcolm, to followed by Michael.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you about oil, but that was helpful. But you'll understand the political sensitivities of that. I mean, how often, when would you next be revising your sort of estimates in terms of oil? Is that done on a regular basis, or?
Well, we basically do it for each of the economic and fiscal outlook publications we produce. The date of that depends on when the Chancellor sets the autumn statement and the budget, but typically it would be late November and early March. We'll also, we produce a fiscal sustainability report in July, which is a much longer horizon publication over 50 years, and so we'll need to return to the subject then. But so you have two, depending on how you look at it, 3 views of this, but linking it specifically to a detailed forecast of oil receipts, November and March, essentially.
Is that out now, the March one?
Yeah, that's the budget. That's the budget one we're talking about here. Yeah.
And I mean, that was useful, the explanation you gave. I mean, do you sorry, I haven't read it, but is that kind of commentary in the bulletin that you refer to in terms of how you arrived at those particular estimates, and because in terms of the futures? No,
absolutely. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do when I came to the OBR was to provide a more detailed breakdown of why forecasts for particular receipts streams, not just oil and gas receipt streams, were changing from one forecast to the next. So rather than just simply having a sort of brief textual description of this is a bit higher, this is a bit lower, we show the previous forecast and the current forecast and break down quantitatively the contribution of all those different elements. So, as I said, production, oil and gas, prices, expenditure, other changes. So that's all in the publication. Yes.
Views that different organisations have, because that seems to be the main currency of debate. That that Jamie's talking about the OECD. Somebody else will quote the Bank of Norway in the opposite direction? I mean, do you sort of source it in that kind of way or not really?
We haven't at that stage. I mean, we have to make a central assumption to come out with a particular forecast. If you're coming to the talk I'm going to give this evening, you'll find a chart with a selection of different oil prices in it.
Feature again this evening, very good. Well, obviously, if we go down the independence route, oil will be very important. If we stick with any form of devolution, the block grant adjustment will be very important, which is why people have been asking about that. I mean, you show, and I accept it's not for you to make decisions about the mechanism for that, but your chart shows the Scottish share of income tax going down slightly recently, and you explained the reasons for that. But I suppose what I'm wondering is whether that is a problem for any block grant adjustment, if that's going to be indexed to some overall UK income tax receipts, presumably the equivalent 10p receipts. Is that a problem, the kind of changes you described potentially? Or?
Well, as I say, it comes back to the issue about, what is the shared view of what is fair in terms of the size of this, and is it you can try to conceptualize this as you would, one view of fairness, I'm not advocating this, but you could say is you want to ensure that the block grant reduction takes place such that you would not anticipate there to be a net fiscal transfer in either direction, Scotland, rest of the UK, looking at the expected future value of the block grant versus what you would have got out of continuing to have the SDLT system. Now, you could achieve those answers by having different starting points for the block grant and then moving it in different ways in the future. Block grant reduction differing in the future, which could theoretically end up with the same sort of results. So there's presumably some trade-off that will have to be made between coming up with a system that is relatively simple and one that is broadly accepted as fair, given the uncertainties about nobody being entirely confident what SDLT would be generating you in future years, and indeed what the path of broader public expenditure would be, and therefore the size of the block grant reduction.
It's possible to have a fair system of indexation that doesn't, in fact, involve random changes which really no one's really responsible for in economic terms.
Well, it's clearly desirable to have a negotiation that ends up with a view that everybody ex ante believes to be fair at the time the deal is made. The difficulty, of course, is that if things turn out differently, ex post, they may not think it's fair, but that's, then that brings you back to the issue about whether you want to be able to revisit this after the event, which is well above my pay grade.
Just briefly onto the SDLT situation. And on page 2 of your Economic and Fiscal Outlook Scottish Tax Forecast paper, you say that once final decisions have been made about the land tax, we will produce forecasts based on the new tax regime. I was just wondering, I think you've possibly answered or partly answered this already, but are you anticipating that you will do those forecasts anyway, or are those forecasts related to the block grant adjustment for that tax?
Well, as I understand, they're not related to the block grant adjustment.
Right,
that's the new system
right.
which will come in, which is for the Scottish Government to design. My understanding, I mean, you'll correct me, I read it, I think possibly in the briefing for the committee, that the current expectation was that the rates and bands for the new transactions tax were unlikely to be set much in advance of the beginning of the fiscal year at which they will take effect, which would suggest that there's a relatively brief period of time, to look at that and to check the sensitivities. But I mean, this is one of the issues that we'd want to obviously talk to Revenue Scotland about is, what work do we need to do in advance of the introduction of this so that we come up with a set of forecasts that we are, from our purposes, happy with. And as I say, it depends whether the Scottish Government wishes to publish other numbers in addition to the ones we'll need to publish for our own purposes. But obviously having a good discussion with them ahead of that will be quite important, because presumably the bands and the rates are going to be set initially given some view of what the Scottish Government wants to raise from this tax, which doesn't necessarily need to be exactly the same amount that was raised from the existing system of SDLT. And obviously, the sooner the parameters of that are known, the more time you have to crunch the numbers and think about the uncertainties.
If I could just move on to a couple of areas of more general forecasting. I mean, you said you did refer to business investment being revised down, but you were quite low key about that because you said, well, some of that was because of a higher base, and then you said business investment would be okay in the medium term. But on the table, I haven't got a page number for it, sorry, but it's got business investment -3 in 2013, -2.1 in 2014. -1.6, -1.5, -0.9. That's for the next 5 years. So it looks as if it's a lot more problematic than your commentary suggested.
Well, again, with business investments, you're dealing with a number that is extremely volatile from quarter to quarter, and where the revisions to those numbers can be quite large. So annual growth rates can often be changed quite significantly because the ONS will take a different view about what the level of business investment was, as it were, at the tail end of the preceding year. So I think if you look at the broader picture, and we did have a chart in here somewhere, in terms of the real terms, perhaps surprisingly, the net change in business investment from the point at which the recession started has not been dramatically different from the experience of the 1990s. There was a rather sharper fall and a bit more of a pickup. Looking forward, we're anticipating that is weaker. We're not expecting a 90s style recovery in business investment in real terms, given we're not going to have a 90s style recovery in the rest of the economy. So we have a weaker profile for that looking forward. So the net effect there, at the moment, going back, things have been closer to the 1990s than you might have anticipated, but all these numbers could be revised. Looking forward, we're more pessimistic.
Well, I'm told it's down 19% from 2007, which I think is a lot worse than in the 1990s and in previous recessions. But, I mean, irrespective of that, surely, even if it fluctuates from quarter to quarter, to be going down significantly over the next 5 years must... Well, anyway, I suppose the more general question is, I think you were expecting in previous reports that, revival of exports and business investment would be crucial to rebalancing the economy away from financial services. So I suppose the question is, why is it not happening? Because it's not as if companies are short of cash, is it?
No, well, that latter point is an interesting one. There's certainly... you would draw a distinction between smaller firms who are likely to be more affected in their ability to invest by credit conditions and difficulties getting the money from banks, relative to larger companies which are less reliant on banks for that. And as you say, corporate cash piles are relatively large. Our view, as I think we discussed when we were here last year, is that maybe not as much of that money is actually in the hands of firms that are likely to do plant and machinery investment, as the official statistics may suggest. More of it may be in the hands of hedge funds, for example, which is one reason for why we've taken a relatively cautious view relative to, say, what we would have been saying back in 2010. As I say, in terms of the level, if you've got the report, page 58 shows you the comparison with the path in our forecast versus the 1990s. So you can see there, the peak to full trough, as you say, about 20%, roughly what we're looking at there, of which roughly half has been recovered in the 1990s. The trough was slightly higher, the expansion slightly less, and 19 quarters from the pre-recession peak, you're in roughly the same position. But if you look at this picture, the numbers may be revised, and even as ever, the old joke, history is as hard, the past is as hard to predict as the future in this particular area.
That's a good quote for tomorrow's debate. Thank you very much. Now, last question. These targets, so you said that the government, UK government, that is, would meet its first target, but it was going to miss its supplementary target. And again, you say, page 15 of the, I think it's your executive summary, I've got public sector net debt is now expected to be around 7.5% of GDP, higher than we forecast in December. That seems a very big increase over a very short period of time. That reflects a combination of factors. The
the fact that we've got higher borrowing over the intervening period in cash terms clearly means that the cash value of debt in 2015-16 would be higher than we anticipated back in December. But I also pointed out earlier on that we've revised the estimated total cash size of the economy. So if you look at debt as a share of GDP, the numerator has gone up and the denominator has gone down. The cash amount of debt is higher than anticipated, and the thing you're dividing it by, the cash size of the economy, is smaller. So there's a mutually reinforcing effect which pushes the level up. There's also a change given in the assumptions we make about the way in which the Debt Management Office sells gilts, which has another contribution to that, which I won't bore you with. But the previous two, higher numerator, lower denominator are the main factors.
So does that, I mean, the Institute of Fiscal Studies suggests that really perhaps there should be a new rule, either targeting the total level of public debt, which presumably would avoid some of the problems you've emphasised, or they even suggested measuring the fraction of future tax revenues that have been pre-committed to meeting liabilities accrued by current and previous governments. Would you support that kind of change, or is it not your business to comment on those kind of things?
Well, it's not my business now, but given I wrote that proposal in the Green Budget for the IFS some years ago, it would be churlish to dump on it from a great height at this stage.
Okay, very good.
The commitments, the idea behind the commitments proposal is you could argue that you would be happier with a higher level of public debt if if it's relatively cheap to borrow, and vice versa. So if you basically had a commitment of how much we're going to have to devote in future to servicing debt, then that would allow you to have a higher level of debt when interest rates are relatively low. Then when it becomes more expensive for the government to borrow, you would be more resistant to that. As I say, that's now not at all my purview, but that's what I would have said if you took me back 3 years.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Michael, to be followed by John.
Thanks, Convener. Malcolm asked the questions I was going to ask on SDLT, but there's only one that still remains, just for clarification in my own mind. You talked about the 6,000s or the 3,000s of change forecast up to about 2017. Certainly within, when you talk about the overall economy, those are very small figures, but when you look at specific taxes like SDLT or aggregate tax, whatever, it becomes even smaller. I would imagine the difference in growth or the marginal change. Even across the whole of the UK, it's not a particularly significant figure, but will you be looking to see what the sort of marginal change would be in the Scottish economy in relation to the changes in SDLT to LBTT and what have you? How significant do you think it might be?
Yeah, well, it's not surprising, certainly, that you would expect a tax on property transactions to be relatively volatile and to have larger swings in it than the economy as a whole, or indeed than taxes like income tax, which broadly speaking move in line with movements in the economy as a whole. That's because it's partly determined by house prices and it's partly determined by the level of transactions, both of which are not simply affected by the amount of income that's sloshing around in the economy, but about people's expectations of where house prices are going to move in the future. One of the reasons why we have relatively strong growth in SDLT looking forward is that at the moment housing transactions, the number of purchases and sales is very low relative to long-term averages. And that's understandable given credit conditions, difficulties people have getting deposits, ability to get relatively high loan-to-value mortgages, etc. Over time, you would expect that to move up. Otherwise, so the way we try to anchor this in the long term is to say, in the past, on average, people stay in a given house for 19 years or thereabouts. And there is a level of housing transactions that is consistent with that being each year, that is consistent with that being the case. So at the moment, if housing transactions stayed where they were, people would be moving a lot less frequently than once every 19 years. And that doesn't seem to be particularly plausible once the credit condition system is proven, which is why we have a sort of trend improvement. Now, exactly how quickly that rebounds, what the new normal is, will the future be once every 19 years or something different, is all sorts of uncertainty. And in each forecast you produce, you may be, having to make new judgments about where that ends up. In terms of the house prices, what we basically do is take the average of people's of outside forecasters' expectations of where house prices are going to move in the near term, and then assume that house prices move in line with cash income in the economy over a longer period, for want of a relatively simple way of doing that. Over time, with the move to there will be an issue in terms of the design of the new transactions tax, of whether that makes the system more or less, whether you get more or less of an adjustment to receipts depending on how quickly prices move, and it will make a difference presumably to the distribution of whether house prices are rising more quickly at the top of the market versus the bottom. I suspect you'll need quite a period of the new system being up and running, and if the bands and the rates are relatively stable, you start to get a grip on how that system is working. If you move them around early on, it gets harder. That will also make it harder to work it out. So I think until you've actually seen that and seen it operating, it's hard to know whether this is going to be more or less volatile as a revenue stream relative to the system you've got at the moment, leaving aside whether the Scottish economy as a whole is also more likely to be volatile or not. I mean, we, as you know, don't have the resources to do a separate Scottish macro forecast alongside this. Others may do that.
Okay. And on a separate issue, and it may not be one that you would cover, and if that's the case, then fine, but it's just to ask the question that the Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions has said that he's trying to manage the growth in welfare payments at the moment. Clearly wants to reduce the amount of money that's been spent there. But he's not, overall the economy, the Chancellor's not going to meet his borrowing targets according to your own figures. So what we have at the moment is a situation where £19 billion is going to be taken out of the economy overall because of the reductions in welfare spending. But borrowing's still going to increase. Will that have an impact, the amount of money that can be spent by people who are on welfare in terms of the local economies or the wider economy? Taking 19 billion, you talked about figures, the reduction from 10 billion to 6 billion in oil forecasts. Well, we're talking about 19 billion coming out of the economy, or the potential spend of people, at the same time as the government's going to increase its borrowing anyway. So have you factored any of that into the equation?
We're trying to take as best account as we can of what the existing policies are. The feedback to the economy can be noticeable on occasions. I mean, if you look back at the relative strength of household disposable incomes over the past year, which has a feed-through effect to consumer spending, it partly reflects that we had a relatively high inflation rate in September 2011, which is then used to determine the increase in benefit payments, the generosity of most benefit payments in the subsequent financial year, which is one reason why in that year in particular disposable income and consumer spending was perhaps slightly higher than you would otherwise have expected. What I've not done is, I can't give you a figure for how much difference, how different it would look if you took all of that set of measures out, but that illustrates that there can be some sensitivity to this. I mean, it remains to be seen. I mean, we'll obviously look with interest to see how the government frames that target for what it wants to do about the control of welfare spending there. At the moment, we forecast the spending on particular benefits and tax credits on the basis of the rules and eligibility that is there in existing policy. I suspect we will continue to do that if it remains to be seen whether the government makes a commitment, for example, to the total amount of welfare spending that there is going to be, and that therefore there is a commitment to pull some levels down if others are higher than expected. We'd have to look and see what we wanted to do if they came out with that sort of a policy. But it's something that at the moment we look at rates, eligibility, and what we think is going to happen to earnings and unemployment, etc., and come up with forecasts accordingly. At one level, the idea of trying to target welfare or to thinking about welfare payments as something that is controllable is a sort of back to the future. There used to be a thing called the new control total, in which central government tried to manage total spending minus that bit of social security spending which goes up and down with the ups and downs of the economy, plus local authorities self-financed spending and debt interest, etc. So this might not be a dramatic departure from past performance, from past systems of public expenditure control, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see in concrete terms what they're planning to do on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I just want to ask you a supplementary in terms of what Michael was talking about with regard to SDLT. In terms of your forecasts, the OBR's forecasts from March 2012 relative to March this year have actually been adjusted by 13% downwards. And yet you're still predicting over the next 5 years there's going to be an 85% increase in receipts in Scotland. Now, the Scottish Property Federation has denounced this as being wildly optimistic. I mean, given the fact that you've already had to do a significant readjustment looking at financial year 2011-12, just over the last year, I mean, can you possibly be confident? I know you talked about, the number of times people move house now, but how can you possibly be confident that such a dramatic growth in current economic conditions can take place?
Well, we can't be confident. That's that's a central estimate around which there is huge uncertainty. As I say, the uncertainties are both what's going to happen to house prices,
sure,
and what's going to happen to the amount of transactions. So that's linked to what's going to go on in terms of people's incomes, people's expectations of future incomes, people's expectations of whether now is a good time or not to buy or sell, given where they think house prices are going to go. It reflects their people's ability to build up deposits at a time when, your lenders are requiring larger deposits. It depends on the extent to which we see a return to the availability of relatively large loan-to-value ratio mortgages. So there's a huge number of uncertainties, and therefore I'm not at all confident that things are going to turn out exactly as that suggests. But that's the central forecast we've produced, and I think it does underline the fact that when you with your transactions tax, I presume that there will be similar volatility issues that you'll need to manage, because if it's still dependent fundamentally on house prices and on transactions, those uncertainties are going to be there in the new system as well as the current one.
I think we're all aware, that it's not an exact science, but given the fact that economic growth is very sluggish, and there are real barriers to people actually buying houses, such as the size of deposit they have to pay, the willingness of banks to lend, etc., etc. I mean, how close do you liaise with organisations such as the Scottish Property Federation, its UK equivalent, etc., in terms of reducing figures? Because I do think 85%, projected increase in revenue does seem pretty optimistic by any standards, I would have thought.
Well, obviously, we're looking at. I mean, we have a
that's after you're reducing the forecast for the 2012 by 13%. Still, you're projecting an 85% increase. So, as I say, we are actually mechanically using expectations from outside forecasters for the house price movements in the near term. So there's an automatic link there. As I say, over the longer term, in terms of prices, linking house prices to cash growth in incomes in the economy, there's no guarantee that will turn out. It's a relatively simple, relatively defensible central assumption to make, I think. In terms of the changes in transactions, as I say, you have the puzzle of what the long-term return is. So I don't know whether the SPF have a view that fundamentally we're going to move to a world in which people just move house half as frequently as they previously did. That would be a perfectly reasonable thing for them to conclude. And if you did that, you would end up with a lower number. So, as I say, we've got a relatively long transition as credit conditions improve, the banking system unglues to get back to that, and that plus a relatively mechanistic assumption about house prices moving broadly in line with incomes. But there is huge uncertainty over this. Yes. I mean, but there are many people who actually in the property industry who still think that house prices are overvalued in certain parts of the country, and there's no necessarily although people may move as frequently, it doesn't necessarily mean that house prices will actually increase. I mean, for example, if you have the same number of transactions, to get 85% more income, you have to have a significant increase in house prices, and there's not really any evidence that house prices, certainly in Scotland, are likely to grow at that kind of rapidity, surely.
Yes, well, I mean, obviously, from our point of view, we've produced a forecast for the UK. The Scottish share is particularly volatile here. The attempts to basically, the idea of an alternative would be to have a much more sophisticated econometric model, which was trying to bring in determinants there, which on the basis of the discussions that we had with HMRC, in which the Scottish Government were involved, the imperfect approach of assuming a constant share seems to be the best way to go. As I say, I think over time it'll be interesting to see whether the new data sources, the fact that you may end up with a system that, depending on how it is designed, may be more or less predictable in its outcome. I mean, obviously one feature of the existing SDLT, which, again, it's not my job now to talk about the merits of individual tax systems. In my previous job, I would have said SDLT was the year after year winner of worst designed tax in the British tax system. You'll have to ask Paul Johnson whether he would still be of that view. One thing I understand that you're going to do with the transactions tax is to get rid of this slab structure, which means that, transactions bunch at particular levels. So I guess over time it will also be interesting to see whether that move produces a smoother and less volatile path for receipts. I don't have a view on that yet.
You said, though, that Scottish house prices were particularly volatile. Surely London's much more volatile. I mean, I didn't think Scotland's house prices were particularly volatile in the UK context.
No, the Scottish share is volatile, partly precisely because of London moving the other amount.
Okay, thank you. Okay, John, to be followed by Gavin.
Hey, thanks, Convener. I mean, listening to all of this for the last hour or so, I just wonder the kind of wider question of, are we expecting too much by way of accuracy of forecasts? And I mean, we look at a chart here and it tells us that, UK income tax receipts will have grown 6.81% in 2017-18. And I mean, in reality, probably going to be higher or lower than that. I mean, I like the fan charts idea that you produce, where as we move forward, it gets wider and wider between what the maximum's likely to be or the minimum's likely to be. I mean, do you think we're being unfair or the media's being unfair in pinning you down on one figure when actually when you come here you're saying, well, it could be varied?
I wouldn't complain about unfairness. That's like, sailors complaining about the sea. If you do forecast, that's the world you live in. I mean, we had a choice. I mean, there's arguably a case that says, if you've read the report, you'll see there's an awful lot of precision and an awful lot of things to one decimal place and breaking down a change in a receipt into a whole different number of areas. And you could argue that basically that just creates a spurious sense of precision. If you look, for example, at the Bank of England's inflation report, it's not full of forecast numbers in the same way. There's lots of very detailed, quantitatively informed analysis, but they produce a couple of fan charts. They don't give you point estimates for what's going to happen to exports or consumption, etc. And their argument for that, I think, would be to say providing those point estimates just gives people the impression that we can be unduly precise about this. We want to create a sort of broader picture and to say, look, there are uncertainties about this, but, focusing people on the wood rather than the trees. I think the reason I've, as it were, gone in the other direction since we've been created is that fundamentally the creation of the OBR was a desire to ensure that public finance forecasts were best professional judgment with which people can and almost certainly will disagree on a regular basis, but not infected by politically motivated wishful thinking. And to do that, my view is that you basically have to show you're working. And therefore, transparency, providing more detail on exactly how things are moving, has been something that I've aimed very much to do, and I thus inflict a relatively thick document on you as a result. That's not because I believe I'm smarter than the Bank of England and I can forecast things to one decimal place that they can't. It's that given the nature of the job we've been given, I think it's incumbent on us to show our working to the maximum possible degree so that people can see why things are moving and reach their own judgments about whether they think that is sensible or not. As you say, we try to underline the uncertainty in our forecast, and we do it in a number of ways. One, as you described, is to do the fan chart, which is basically to say, you know, if you were coming from Mars and all you knew was the forecast that we've published today, plus how accurate on average have such forecasts been in the past, this is how much confidence you should place on it. And therefore, you can do that at a relatively high level. So we do it for overall government borrowing, we do it for economic growth. It would be quite hard to do it for individual taxes because the details of the policy changes so much. And take oil and gas receipts, you've got you've got 5 or 6 quite volatile individual determinants that all have to be added together to produce the end forecast. So we use fan charts. We try to pick out some of the features of the economic forecast that are crucial to the judgments that we make about whether the government will hit its target or not, and say how different would their ability to hit the target look if, for example, the recovery was stronger or weaker, there was more or less spare capacity, the amount the government has to pay to borrow is higher or lower. And so you can kick the tires of the forecast that way. You can say which bit of the forecast, you know, is the government most vulnerable to forecasting errors in terms of it knocking them off course to hit the targets that they've given. And so, for example, on the fiscal mandate, the deficit target, it's our view of how much spare capacity there is in the economy, and therefore how much of the amount of borrowing you're doing is structural, persistent, how much of it alternatively is relatively temporary and will go away as the economy recovers. And then we also use scenarios to pick up, you know, particular issues in economic debate that people are interested in and reflecting that. So we try to provide as much information as we can for people who may disagree with our view of the economy or particular drivers of these things, to say, well, I have a different view on this, and I can see from the detail they've given me that if I'm more optimistic about oil prices or less optimistic about production or whatever it might be, I can see more clearly how much difference that would make. There's then the issue about what policymakers do with all this, which is not my job to tell them what they should do about this, but clearly policy needs to be made in full knowledge of the uncertainty and the difficulty of doing economic forecasting and fiscal forecasting. So all the debates I gather you've been having about whether oil receipts ought to be, whether there should be some sort of stabilisation process or not in a world in which, you know, an independent Scotland would have a much higher proportion of its receipts coming from a relatively volatile source than would be the case elsewhere. Those are exactly the sort of issues with which policymakers, I think, necessarily and rightly wrestle. And it's also, you know, it's what forces, certainly take the UK government at the moment, them to decide, well, OK, we're not just going to aim to hit this target exactly, i.e. that there's a 50% chance we hit it or miss it, but how much wiggle room do you want to put in there? So these are difficult additional choices that policymakers have to make above and beyond what we pointy heads have to do in terms of giving the numbers that we hope will allow people to make those decisions and the rest of the world to say what decisions they make.
I mean, I have to say, I agree largely with what you're saying. I mean, I think it is better to have more information out there than less. But I think you know, you then get beaten with the stick that in December you said this and in March it looks quite different. And you are giving us the reasons when people have asked you for that. But I don't know whether in the long run that affects. I mean, I think people have a lot of respect for you individually, but the organisation.
That's what you mean, yes.
The organisation as a whole does tend to get slated a bit when the forecasts don't turn out.
I have a regular and enjoyable appearance on Newsnight, which Jeremy Paxman says something along the lines of, last time you said this, now you're saying this. How do we know you're going to be right this time? And I say, you don't. Yes. And the interview proceeds accordingly.
I think it sometimes comes across better in person than on paper, but anyway. I mean, you used the word vulnerable in there, which I thought was a good one, that certain obviously certain forecasts are more or less important and are going to have more or less importance on the government and the economy and so on. And there was two I wanted to particularly ask you about, like how vulnerable we are, and vulnerable in a positive and negative sense. I mean, one being exchange rates, which you've already mentioned, and the whole question of exports, and the fact that although the exchange rate has been going down, and I think some people would say it's been going down since the 50s, it hasn't had the boost in exports that we might have expected. Is that going forward then? Is that something we are vulnerable to as well?
Well, one of the scenarios, I mentioned one of the ways we look at uncertainties is to do scenarios, and the one that we've chosen for this forecast is to say, what are the issues you'd need to worry about if there was a further 15% fall in the exchange rate, for example. And you highlight some of the uncertainties that mean that it's hard to know even what the direction up or down on the economy would be as a consequence of that. As you rightly point out, the fall in the exchange rate recently, if anything, people have been surprised by the relatively modest impact that has had on export performance. But on the other hand, perhaps also surprised by how much it's done to weaken economic activity by pushing up import prices, which therefore squeezes consumer budgets and reduces the contribution from real consumption. And so one obvious issue, if you were to have a further fall in the exchange rate, would be, would the story be more like it has been most recently, with the disappointments or the surprises coming in those directions, or go back to the early 1990s when we were surprised by how little the fall in the exchange rate after 1992 fed through to inflation, and you had a more upbeat response to exports. So this is clearly a source of uncertainty. I mentioned earlier, actually interpreting what's going on the export side has been particularly difficult. There is the possibility that we'll see revisions to the data which suggest there's been more of an export response to the relatively weak exchange rate than we currently think. That happened a couple of years ago. It's also, I think, quite useful to look at the export performance in a slightly more disaggregated way. You certainly see the disappointment showing up more on the services side than on the goods side, where the fall in the exchange rate seems to have arrested rather more the trend loss of market share on the goods side, whereas on the services side there's been a more dramatic deterioration. Part of that's down.
Is there a problem there that our goods side had fallen so much anyway that it's a low base we're trying to grow from?
That could be. We've not looked at that specifically. Whether you would expect a different sized response with the starting level as a share of GDP, I don't know the answer to that question. On the services side, financial services exports have fallen particularly sharply. Interestingly, you've also seen a decline in US financial services exports. So one question is whether there is less demand globally for the sorts of financial services that the UK and the US tend to provide. That may be part of the explanation. There's also the difficulty of how exactly do you measure financial services exports? If you're in a situation where financial institutions are reducing their balance sheets, they're reducing their exposure overseas, and you think, well, let's assume that financial services exports are some proportion of the size of that balance sheet overseas, and you shrink it, then maybe you conclude that there's less financial. It may be a rather more automatic response to what's happening to financial institutions' global exposure. So it's But it's interesting that this has been, in terms of why has the economy not grown as rapidly as we expected 2-3 years ago, it's been an export story more recently, whereas in the earlier period it was inflation basically meaning that a given amount of cash consumer spending didn't go as far in terms of the goods and services produced and consumed.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, the other area that was crossing my mind with vulnerability is to do with interest rates. And I mean, although the borrowing, we're saying, well, maybe it's not so important what it is relative to GDP. I think you did mention, or somebody else mentioned that, well, actually interest rates is part of that equation as well, because if it's higher interest rates, you can afford to borrow less and so on. I mean, I think I've still got a fear for individuals who are used to low interest rates, although some of us remember quite high ones in the past. And as a country, do we, if we lose credibility and AAA ratings and these things, does that mean we might be paying higher interest rates in the future, and what would the impact of all of that be?
Yeah, and there are two issues there. There's the interest rates that businesses and companies are paying, and there's the interest rates that the government is paying, which have different implications. On the interest rates that individuals are, that the private sector is paying, I mean, one potential source of reassurance is that if
I'm still here.
that's right. Seize power while he was in absence.
Are we recorded, John?
Okay, folks, we'll recommence the session. Apologies for that interlude. John, the floor is still yours.
Okay, well, I think Mr. Chote was discussing it was interest rates, if I remember correctly, and I think it was I'd asked a general question about interest rates, but I think you were drawing the distinction between the interest rates that either a company or an individual pays, or the government maybe pays.
That's right. Looking on the private sector side, I mean, clearly there would be a concern about vulnerability if interest rates started to rise with consequences for mortgage payments, etc. At a macro level, you could take comfort from the fact that presumably interest rates are going to start to rise at a policy level once incomes and activity in the economy is rising, which would place people in a better position to deal with that. At an aggregate level, although clearly there would be vulnerability for some people more than for others. I think in terms of the rise in policy rates, one uncertainty is to what extent that feeds through, what proportion of the change in policy rates feeds through to the rates people are actually paying, given the rates people are actually paying didn't fall as far as the policy rates. Presumably the same would be true if you moved in the other direction, and so there would be some offset there. In terms of the interest rates that the government has to pay, I mean, we do include in the this is one of the parameters that I said we test the government's ability to hit its targets relative to what would happen if interest rates that the government pays change. If they get higher, obviously it makes the fiscal position more difficult. The UK traditionally has been relatively insulated here because the government's borrowing tends to be at relatively long maturities relative to borrowing by most other governments. So there's a bit of a shock absorber if the interest rate is rising, because you're not rolling over a lot of your debt all the time, and it doesn't feed straight through to the average interest rate paid on the stock of debt. It's also worth bearing in mind that although a rise in interest rates increases the amount of money that the government has to pay out, if it's associated with a rise in the interest rates on other instruments, the government also gets some additional revenue on when interest rates rise, as well as having to pay out more, and so it's not as much. So there's still a negative hit, but it's partially offsetting.
We'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Okay, Gavin, to follow by Jean.
Thanks, Kavira. I want to ask just a few questions about the Scottish tax forecast, the paper you produced on that. In relation to stamp duty land tax, page 9 of your paper, in terms of trying to project forwards what you think you're going to get from SDLT, for residential you use the outturn share of the latest year, but for commercial you use a 3-year average of the Scottish share and project that forward. So I'm just wondering, why is there a difference between the sort of number of years you would use between residential and commercial?
Basically looking back at the volatility and whether there is a trend and whether there is volatility in those numbers going back. If you have it bouncing up and down from year to year, but with no obvious trend, i.e. upwards or downwards, then it's quite sensible to take a number of years to sort of smooth that out and project it going forward. If you had a line that was moving steadily upwards, and you took the average of the last 3 years, it's going to look slightly lower, whereas your expectation would be that the trend might continue. So I think it's basically, I don't have the back data on me, but I suspect it's the distinction between whether it's volatile on a year-to-year basis or whether the last year is probably a better guide than that to forecasting forward.
Okay, thank you. In the same paper, over the page on page 10, table 1.7, you've got a breakdown between residential and non-residential SDLT. So obviously SDLT is a fairly volatile tax, as we've all acknowledged. But in terms of your projections going forward, is it fair to say that residential is more or quite a bit more volatile than non-residential? And non-residential still goes up, but it seems to be slightly flatter than residential, which seems to go up. It almost doubles over a sort of 5-year period.
I would suspect that is down to the fact that the residential forecast is incorporating this belief that transactions are at a historically low level, and that we've basically assumed that there is an average number of transactions per year consistent with an average duration of tenure at the end to which you return, which would be less. There's less obviously a commercial property turns over a particular period of time, because you're not just dealing with a house that looks much the same now as it did 50 years previously, etc. So you'd be using a different approach on that score.
Okay, so just so I got that correct, in terms of residential transactions at the moment, in your view, it's way below trend at the moment, and you anticipate that at some point it returns to trend.
Yes, I think, I can't remember the number precisely, but I think if you were to continue with the current level of transactions, people will be moving roughly once every 30 years rather than roughly once every 20 years. Now, it may be that we're moving to that new world, but it doesn't seem the most obvious central expectation. I'm not sure 30 is the right number. It's
Sure, yeah,
broadly
no,
that area of magnitude.
I get your point. But in terms of non-residential transactions, you don't, we're probably below trend, but you don't think we're significantly below trend, which is why the increases are much smaller. Is
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, thank you. If I move on to the next tax you cover in the paper, landfill tax, just a couple of questions about I think we come on to that as a committee fairly soon. In terms of the forecast there, over say a 5-year period, you see sort of broadly a 10% rise in the take of tax, give or take a percent or two. How likely is that to happen, given that governments north and south of the border are pushing hard to reduce what goes to landfill? So I know that the tax rate goes up, but do you think the tax rate goes up more than the reduction in tonnage, which it ends up with increasing tax take?
Yes, so I mean, you, as you say, you've got two things pushing in opposite directions here, and we have the receipts rising over time. So there are some pre-announced increases which are here. We then assume for the purposes of the forecast that the rate rises in line with inflation thereafter, which is obviously pushing the cash number up. On the other side, you have tonnage declining, and I think the main reason why we're less optimistic about receipts from this source than we were previously is that we basically assumed that the historical downward trend in this persists. What we've not taken explicit account of is the Scottish government, or as you say, the wider UK government's views on their targets for waste, which I think are quite stretching in terms of the Scottish government, certainly. I mean, rather similarly to the way in which we look at targets on carbon emissions, etc., we don't base our forecasts on the assumption that governments will do whatever will be necessary in order to bring about those targets. We say, let's look at the rates and rules that there are at the moment, not constrain ourselves at that. But as you say, there is a declining trend here, which is reflected, and that's offsetting the change in the rates.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you. Just one other very narrow question prompted by a question Malcolm Chisholm asked. He asked about the money currently held by companies, some people describe it as the piles of cash they're sitting on waiting to be invested, and it just reminded me that we'd had a similar discussion last year. I think I'm right in saying that you said either the Treasury or the Bank of England assume that 80% of those amounts of money are held by companies that could in reality invest that money, the other 20% by presumably hedge funds or others that couldn't. You, I think, said you didn't think the 80% figure was correct. You thought it was lower than that. I just wonder if you or the OBR have a view on what the correct percentage is, or what are more likely percentages?
But I think that the Office for National Statistics, who are the people who actually have to make that assumption, are looking at this, and so I think we're going to wait and see what whether they come out with a different view. I mean, they're aware of both we and the Bank of England have raised this issue, so sure. I think as part of their ongoing business, they're looking at whether there's a sensible allocation. It's basically down to what sort of companies are holding money in overseas bank holdings. I think that's basically it's the allocation of that, and the 80% number is one that was from some years ago, before the growth of non-bank financial institutions had been quite as rapid as it has been over the intervening period, and that I think they're going to look and see whether they need to make any adjustments on that basis.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jean, to the followed by Malcolm.
Thank you. I wanted to go to the area of employment and some of the figures that are in the report in terms of the likelihood of the next 11 years seeing 2.8 people fewer employed in the public sector. But you refer to something, we talk about the private sector a bit, but you refer to the market sector. And I just wanted to ask you, does that include, is that a general change to talk about a market sector as opposed to a private sector, which would include social enterprise and the growth of other organisations set up often to undertake work that might have been undertaken by these same people who are no longer employed in the public sector?
I think that's right. I mean, it's a It's the definition of basically total employment minus general government employment, which I think the sorts of institutions you're talking about would be among those that different people would place on different sides of a line if you said, was this public sector versus private sector? And so, you know, even within these definitions, for example, there have been changes of mind over whether people working in further education are part of general government or are part of the wider market sector, and that's made some of these comparisons difficult to do. I mean, behind all of this is basically an approach to forecasting general government employment, which essentially is saying, what can we discern from the government's spending plans about the pot of money that will be available in future years to pay the wages and salaries of general government workers, and what information do we have about the changes in pay bill per head, you know, whether there's wage drift going on, etc. And we then distill from that a view about, you know, basically how many people the public sector will be able to employ on the pot of money the government is currently implicitly allocating to that at the end of the forecast horizon. We look at where we're starting now and say, well, we emphasise those two numbers. If people want to do a forecast of what happens in between, they can take a ruler and join the two lines up and get there. In terms of the private sector employment and employment in total, obviously we're looking at that in the context of our broader macroeconomic forecast, and the puzzle there persistently through this recovery or non-recovery has been how robust employment growth has been in the private sector, given how little has been going on in terms of the increase in output that's being produced, the so-called productivity puzzle. If you had told me in June 2010 what economic growth rates we were going to see over the intervening period, I would probably have told you then that I would have expected unemployment to be about 1.5 million higher now than it actually is, which gives you some sense of the, you know, how remarkable this difference has been. Partly that increase in market sector employment or private sector employment reflects short-term working, part-time working, etc. So some people would say, yes, well, this is not real job growth. But even if you look at hours worked, in the total hours worked in the economy, which would be taking account of those sorts of things, that has been surprising too on the upside, given the weakness of output too. Not to the same degree as total employment, so there is partly a story about a move to greater short-time and part-time working. But I mean, even between our December forecast and this one, the short-term growth news on GDP has been bad. The short-term employment news has been better than expected. A huge uncertainty is of how long that continues to be the case. Will we get to a point in which there is some shakeout and that you see productivity rebounding, in which case you might end up with, even if the economy growth rate of the economy picks up, you don't see that much change in employment. Or you could see something more dramatic in terms of a shakeout. It's probably the single biggest structural uncertainty that any economic forecaster trying to understand what's going on at the moment wrestles with.
Are you privy to the kind of evidence for the forecast in terms of the change in employment? I mean, I think there's a mystery, but some of it's not a mystery in terms of the jobs that people were doing and the jobs that people are now doing.
Well, in terms of outturn, we're using national statistics in terms of the Office for National Statistics views of what employment is. Sometimes the situation can be complicated because you get a different picture of the path if you ask individuals whether they are in work or not, or you ask companies how many jobs they have or are supporting, because obviously there can be, if you've got an individual who has more than one job, and there's more or less of that going on than would normally be the case, then you can sometimes get a change in the amount of individuals reporting that they're employed versus the amount of jobs being reported by employers. So that can confuse things slightly. But we're not estimating for ourselves what the past path of employment has been. We're using the same national statistics that any other forecaster or academic would do when looking at what's going on in the labour market.
And on a different topic, does the Office of Budget Responsibility have any observation on tax not collected?
We basically in every set of forecasts that we're doing for any particular receipt, we implicitly, in some cases explicitly, think about the amount of avoidance or evasion activity that's going on there. There are some taxes where you can do that in a more quantitative way than others. So, for example, we have an explicit estimate of what's called the VAT gap, where, given your knowledge about what's going on in consumer spending, you can have a sense of the theoretical amount of money that you ought to be getting in as a consequence of consumer spending and compare it to the amount that's actually coming in, and then there is a gap of roughly 10% between the two. There are other areas of receipts where, in effect, we are looking at, in projecting our forecast forward, we're basing that on what receipts have come in to date and over the recent past. So in effect, you're often implicitly assuming that whatever the level of avoidance or evasion activity that's going on, we assume that it's roughly the same proportion heading forwards, because by basing your future forecasts on what's actually come in the past rather than what you think ought to have come in if everybody was paying it, then you're filling some of that in. There's then the issue with evasion and avoidance about particular policy measures that the government may announce. In some cases, it may announce a measure that is designed to reduce avoidance in a particular area. One of the things that we do when we decide whether to publicly endorse those estimates, and indeed whether to include them in our forecasts, is to look at whether it's reasonable to assume that the effectiveness of those anti-avoidance measures will erode over time. So there would be a built-in assumption that people are going to find another way through the maze, and you don't necessarily assume that all this money continues to build in over the future. That's very much doing it on a case-by-case basis. With some of these measures, with some of the international agreements that have been done, you can imagine how difficult the evidence base is to deal with here. For example, judging how much receipts you're going to get in as a result of having done a tax disclosure deal with Switzerland, for example. There are lots of uncertainties about, whether that disclosure agreement is going to make people change their behaviour, but there's also a huge amount of uncertainty about how much UK citizens have in Switzerland in the first place. And so that's inevitably another source of uncertainty. So when that deal was done, we took the view that the original estimates that ministers and HMRC came to us about the amount that this was likely to raise, we felt that that was probably a bit too high, and for our forecast, we said that we wanted to assume a lower number, and that was largely on the basis of a judgment about, in a very uncertain world, what was the central assumption about the amount of money that was out there, rather than exactly a difference in view of how people would respond to the policy change per se.
Okay, so when we knew that the Westminster government was recognising that the stamp duty land tax was very vulnerable in certain parts of that, would you take an allowance? You said that you allowed 10% VAT being lost. That's a given? What would the figure be that you would have on the land tax?
Well, as I say, VAT, there's an ability from consumer spending to be able to calculate, with relative confidence, and I emphasise the word relative, what that difference would be. With SDLT, I think more the question would be, if you are basing your expectations of how receipts are likely to grow in the future, and you're basing it on what's come in the past, then you are implicitly taking on board the amount of money that you may not be getting in, even if you don't know that quantity. You're not basically taking a theoretical view about how much we should be bringing in that is not in line with what has actually been brought in the past, and you would take that forward. Then if there are particular policy measures designed to reduce the amount of avoidance, then we try to take explicit account of that. There are some cases where the government identifies a mechanism for avoidance that they don't think people have yet taken full advantage of. And if you announce that change, then it might raise some extra revenue, but in some sense it's just protecting the revenue that's already in the forecast. So what we want to do is not double count that by saying, if they say this is going to bring in X amount more money, and we think that that looks reasonable, if some proportion of that is money that would otherwise have been lost but is not actually recorded in the forecast, we don't want to give them credit twice for that in terms of the forecast that we're producing. So it's there are different ways to approach this given different types of measures and different types of forecasts.
Okay, and just finally, there was a recent publicity about a certain coffee shop that was clearly felt not to be paying tax that it should have been paying. That doesn't exercise your organisation in terms of tax estimates?
Well, certainly not in terms of individual companies. We have to respect the taxpayer confidentiality that HMRC has with individual firms. So when we're talking to them about the amount of receipts that are coming in, they won't say, oh, and this particular firm is producing this amount or not, or we think that this firm can be badgered into producing an additional amount more, which in some cases, there are areas of the economy where a relatively large amount of receipts comes from a relatively small number of firms. So that can be awkward. There we have to rely on the large business service at HMRC, their dealings with these firms, and we have to decide whether we are persuaded by the information they can bring to us, which is necessarily anonymised, in incorporating that in the forecast that we produce.
Thank you.
The pace of recovery has slowed down, obviously, and you say it's constrained by slow growth in productivity and incomes. And in your presentation today, you said you referred to weaker than expected earnings growth. So I'm just wondering about that. I mean, presumably that's in the private sector, because do we not know about earnings growth in the public sector? Is that not well controlled, as it were?
We're primarily talking here about, as I say, the surprising weakness of productivity and productivity growth in the private sector, where you've seen private sector employment rising quite substantially, while output of the private sector has not been picking up as much. In terms of the public sector, the surprises in terms of the impact on economic growth has actually moved in the opposite direction, rather counterintuitively. What you've done is seen the cash growth rate of public services, spending on public services, clearly slowing quite dramatically to about 1% a year relative to 5% a year prior to the crisis. Now, what has been somewhat surprising is that the contribution to whole economy GDP from that government activity has not fallen by anything like the same amount, relatively much more modestly. We're talking here about government spending that contributes to the consumption and production of goods and services, which therefore is a contributor to GDP, not welfare payments which are taking money from one member of the population to another. It's the bits that are contributing to GDP. And partly that seems to be down to the fact that we, to a greater degree than we had anticipated or taken account of, the direct measures of government output that the ONS feeds into the national accounts have not responded very much to the cut in the generosity of cash spending. So take education as an example. Roughly speaking, the government counts the output of education as being the number of pupils being educated and the exam results that those pupils are getting. As you've cut down the amount of cash spending going into education, that combination of the number of pupils being educated and exam results hasn't moved by anywhere near as much as the cash spending. If the government had decided it was going to implement spending cuts in education by announcing that no child with a name ending in M or later in the alphabet was going to be allowed to go to school anymore, you would have seen a much more direct line here. But the way they choose to measure it, means that actually the government sector's contribution to GDP has held up much more than we anticipated it would do, as cash spending has been squeezed. Now, you can argue whether that is therefore a very sensible measure of value added in the government sector. Maybe the fall in cash spending is showing up in the quality of education in a way that is not picked up by pupil numbers and exam results. But that is not taken into account in measuring the output of the government sector. There's a whole different stream of work that the ONS does, that Professor Tony Atkinson led off on some while ago, trying to look at productivity in the public sector by focusing more on those sorts of quality issues, but that doesn't show up in the national accounts, and it's one reason why, as I say, paradoxically, we still have government spending on goods and services contributing to economic growth at the moment rather than subtracting from it. So I would draw the distinction between the two sectors.
I understand that productivity difference between the public and private sector, but what about earnings growth? I mean, what is actually happening to earnings growth? So you're saying it's weaker than expected. Is there any earnings growth at all, in fact?
I think about 1 point, it's the sort of 1.5% area at the moment. There are new numbers out today, which I haven't seen.
Even in real terms, or is that in cash?
No, that's in cash terms.
Yeah,
and certainly and you know, if you're looking for what do you need to get the economy really motoring again, a very key part of that, because consumer spending is 60 to 70% of spending in the economy, is that you need to get back to a position where earnings are once again growing healthily in excess of inflation. And that has been the fact that was very disappointing, certainly in the 2011 period, helps explain why forecasts tended to be over-optimistic at that stage. Not just that earnings were relatively weak, which helps explain why people have priced themselves into jobs and employment has still been relatively strong, but inflation has been high too. And I don't think we have a return to really healthy growth in real earnings probably until 2015 beyond in the forecast.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because it's not going to happen anytime soon in the public sector. Are you saying you envisage it happening in the private sector then, or in the public sector as well then, or?
In the public sector, we take published pay policy as as far as it's as it's known and explicit in terms of the forecast of government sector employment, looking overall at wage behaviour. Exactly. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we continue to have a relatively weak path for the economy relative to average growth rates in the past, is that it takes some time to get back to this position of having earnings growing in real terms. Some people would place more emphasis on a balance sheet deleveraging story. I think we think that that focusing on this fact that you're not really going to expect to see the economy really motoring until you're back to a position in which where you have consistent, significant real earnings growth is a key to the story. So
you see in the economy beginning to recover from next year 1.8% and then 2.8% by 2017. So, I mean, to what extent is that, well, what's going to bring that about? And I suppose related to what you've been saying, to what extent is that because of earnings growth, or will earnings growth only come after that, or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, you have a growing contribution from consumer spending as you return to positive real earnings growth, which we would hope to improve consumer spending and have that benefit. We have, as we discussed earlier, investment rising as a share of GDP, therefore contributing to growth over this period. That's typical for recoveries. You expect to see investment rising as a share of GDP, although, as I say, we're assuming a slower recovery in real investment than we had in the 1990s. We're assuming another source would be net trade. We're assuming, for the reasons that we've discussed earlier, that we don't get. There is a positive contribution from net trade through the forecast, but not a very big one. So much more is coming from investment and consumption going out than from net trade. In terms of thinking about what the magnitudes of growth are at the end of the forecast horizon and over all of that period, an important question that you have to wrestle with is how much spare capacity do you believe there is in the economy now? By how much do you believe that the economy's ability, its potential to produce goods and services without running into inflationary bottlenecks and therefore having the Bank of England feeling they need to put a stop to it? how does that look over time? Now, there's huge range of views amongst economists as to how much spare capacity there is in the economy at the moment. We, roughly speaking, are working on the assumption that the economy is running about 3% below the level which would be consistent with keeping inflation stable in the medium term. There are some forecasters at 1% or less. There are some who think that the gap is 7%. So if you think there's quite a lot of spare capacity, then once you can actually get spending in the economy motoring again, you would expect there to be the potential for reasonably large, above average growth rates for a time until that spare capacity is used up and you end up in a more stable long-term position. So the fact that we have a 2.8% rate at the end there is partly our belief, or our central assumption, and it's, as with so many of these things, hugely uncertain, is that there is a reasonable amount of spare capacity still in the economy which gives the ability to do that. Some people would argue that there's less spare capacity, that the potential growth rate of the economy is going to be particularly weak, in which case they might see less scope for that to be the case, even if the government or the Bank of England were actually able to get spending motoring again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. It's just a question about the information that's presented in the UK government's budget. And just see if I've picked something up correctly and see if Mr. Chote can help me with it. I understand that in last year's budget there was information provided about the total cost of fiscal consolidation by 2016-17 and also some information about subsequent years, but in this year's budget that information isn't presented. Is that, are you aware, is that the case, and if so, do you have any information as to why that may be the case?
I'm not quite sure which bit. The Treasury, in its own documents, has in the past done a sort of sum of the contribution of tax and spending changes to the total consolidation, which they often use to illustrate the fact that, roughly speaking, there's a 80-20 split between spending and receipts. Is that the numbers you're referring to?
Yeah, I think that's related to it as well, indeed, yes. I think it's essentially they had presented a figure that set out what the total cost of fiscal consolidation measures would be by the year 2016-17, and the information isn't there this year. You don't have any information?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'd have to look at the...
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have it in front. I just have a note about it. Okay, well.
Certainly when, I mean, we don't cover the quote-unquote the size of the consolidation in aggregate in the material that we produce here. Mm-hmm. When I've talked about that in explaining, in talks to explain to people what's been going on, I tend to use my old employers at the IFS, who have a set of estimates of how much the size of the consolidation is over that period of time. Partly the problem with identifying this is, what's the baseline? What do you think would have been happening in the absence of these sorts of measures? And if you have a different baseline, the size of the disease and the cure looks different depending on which one you take.
I mean, my next question would be what your predictions were for these years, but I suppose you just answered it, so the OBR doesn't particularly set that sort of figure out then?
No, as I say, it depends on the baseline. The size of the consolidation in terms of the share of GDP reduction in borrowing that is a result of all the tax and spending measures announced subsequent to budget 2008, I think on the IFS estimate is about 9% of GDP. There's a separate question of what the cost of that is to the, what impact has all of that had on economic growth, which I don't think the Treasury's said anything about that. So I presume that's not the number that you're referring to, but I'm happy to have a look and see if I can identify it more clearly bilaterally.
Okay.
Thank you. That appears to have exhausted the questions from the committee, so I'm just going to ask a couple more just to wind up the session. You'll be glad to know. And the first one is that last year, when you spoke to us committee, the OBR was predicting growth in the UK economy about 0.8%. The following day, I met with Stephen Boyle of the Royal Bank of Scotland, and they were having a seminar here at RBS, and he said that, well, that's far too optimistic. Our growth figures are 0.2%. I remember thinking, that seems on the low side, but it turned out that they were more accurate than the OBR. I'm just wondering why, with all the access to the kind of figures that you have, in your contacts with Treasury, etc., why a company like the RBS was able to predict, I know it's not exact science, but predict more accurately than the OBR was. I mean, there is a feeling, for example, that often the OBR is too optimistic in terms of its predictions.
Well, I mean, two responses to that. The first of which is that we don't actually have any additional information on what is going on in the economy that isn't available to anybody else trying to do an economic forecast. We have to do an economic forecast, much as I would sometimes wish we didn't, because you need to have one that you can feed in to your forecasts of particular tax and revenue streams. And unfortunately, you can't take the Bank of England's or the average of independent forecasts because they don't break down national spending and national income in the degree of detail into the sort of categories that we need to do in order to drive forecasts for particular tax and spending streams. So we don't do an economic forecast because we think we're likely to be any better than the average of outside forecasters. We do it because we need a particular type of economic forecast. What we do is present regularly in the publications that we produce and in greater detail in the the forecast evaluation report in the autumn, is to look at our forecasts in comparison to the other ones that are out there. And so you will see that we tend to be, closer to the average of outside forecasts than to either the top or bottom of that range at any given time. And obviously, if you have a number that comes in at one of those ranges, then the person at the end of that range is going to look particularly smart on that occasion. I think history suggests that it's not always the same people who are looking smart each year. The other thing to bear in mind is that the economic output data that you base these sorts of judgments on are very much a first draft of economic history. Whether the growth rate is closer to 0.2 or to 0.8 when we come back and look at this in 10 years' time is going to be an interesting question. If you look back at the path of the 1990s recession as it is depicted in the official statistics today relative to the way it was depicted in official statistics, say, in 1994, you'll see that the 1990s recession was about 20% shallower, a year shorter, no longer ends in a double dip, compared to the numbers that were produced at that stage. So you have to bear in mind that whenever you're judging, how well you're doing on these sorts of things, that if I came to you looking smug because every number that we'd predicted was bang in line with the Office for National Statistics' latest estimates of the outturn, I'd make sure I never came back here, because on a future occasion history is likely to have been revised and I wouldn't be looking as clever anymore.
Indeed. In terms, just to touch on landfill tax, which Gavin raised specifically, I mean, your predictions a year ago have been, for this current financial year, have been readjusted down by 27%, and for year 2016-17 by 33%. Now, I know you're looking at a share of UK receipts over 3 years for this, but surely it would be much better to actually look specifically at Scottish figures if you're going to make these predictions. And I know you said you didn't really take into account policy necessarily, but surely that's something that should be taken into account. And you also mentioned that you don't have the resources to do Scottish macro forecasts. And is it not better, therefore, that the Scottish Government actually produce these forecasts? Because if you're actually going to be, I know you're empowered by the Treasury, etc., but the UK Government, but if surely you just have to get surely you're in a position where you're getting the information from the Scottish Government and from Revenue Scotland to make predictions, but you're not taking into account the same kind of things, such as policy changes that the Scottish Government might get. So how could you possibly produce more accurate projections than they would do themselves?
Well, I think we're going to, as I say, it may be that following the devolution of the taxes, there's going to be a better evidence base because of the way in which the policies are going to be operated, the sort of data that the Scottish Government or Revenue Scotland are going to want to collect that would enable you to do that. I think one of the difficulties with aggregates levy is that there's not even historically a good basis for actually what the Scottish numbers are, given the way in which the total aggregates numbers are reported by companies across the UK as a whole. Presumably, Revenue Scotland will be thinking about what data they need to be able to come up with a specific aggregates levy forecast for Scotland, and we'll be very interested to talk to them about whether that looks likely to generate a better set of numbers, a better way of producing the information. I mean, from our point of view, we have a statutory responsibility to come up with a central forecast we're happy with. If that's a forecast that has been produced by Revenue Scotland in the same way that we have forecasts for other things produced by HMRC, and we have a useful interaction to everybody's benefit in thinking about that, that'll be great.
Now, over the last year or two, you've been optimistic in terms of economic growth. You've been optimistic in terms of SDLT receipts, landfill tax receipts, UK borrowing. But as Professor Alex Kemp, University of Aberdeen, said, and Jamie touched on it, you've been rather pessimistic in terms of oil forecasts. And you talked about volatility earlier on, but the very eminent Professor David Bell from the University of Stirling in the Sunday Times on 10th of March said, I find this argument about volatility a little bit over-egged because it's always possible to hedge against volatility. What matters is the average price over 5 to 10 years. What's your comment on that?
Well, there's an issue about what the Scottish Government wants to do in response to the knowledge that if that was a much larger proportion of overall receipts, and therefore you wanted to have some sort of mechanism to smooth that out, and in the sort of stabilisation discussions that you have. I think in terms of what the actual outturn has been, it has been very volatile on a year-to-year basis. As I say, we have over-predicted, significantly over-predicted North Sea receipts in 2010 relative to what looks likely to have been the outturn in 2012-13. So I think it's a very reasonable question to say, particularly in an environment where that relatively volatile stream was likely to be a larger proportion of receipts available in total, that presents a slightly different challenge to policymakers than if it is one admittedly very volatile but much smaller comparative flow of revenue stream amongst a whole lot of other ones.
Yes, I mean, comparative to Norway, it's only about half the share of the economy, as you probably know. But do you agree with the Energy Minister, John Hayes, who said through enhanced extraction and new discoveries there is a bright future for oil and gas?
Well, there's a lot of oil and gas still there. Obviously, the industry and other experts have different views on the amount of that. As I say, I think the difficulty in terms of forecasting it on a year-by-year basis is very clear from the outturn data that's come in, and because of the succession of different relatively volatile determinants on their own score. So I think in terms of, you wouldn't want to be pessimistic about the fact that there are receipts there in the future. You would want to be pessimistic about your ability to predict exactly how many of them are going to come in the next 12 months.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, actually. I think that's been a very illuminating session. I'm sure we look forward to the next one. I'll certainly be seeing you over lunch, and I'll be looking forward to your lecture this evening. So I'd like to call this session to a close, and this is the end of our public session, so I'm just going to call a 2-minute recess while Robert and David and official report leave, and then we'll go into private session.